If you can't get enough supply chain, join us in Orlando for GS1 Connect, one of the leading supply chain conferences where you can connect with colleagues, interact with industry experts, tap into the latest best practices, and discover how to use data most efficiently to optimize your operations and grow your business. Be one of our over 200 attending companies and engage with over 120 speakers and over 20 trading partner roundtables to expand your knowledge on supply chain management best practices. Check out the agenda to learn more about our keynote speakers and sessions. We hope to see you there.
With social commerce, there's such a virality that can happen to brands really quickly before they know it. You'd be surprised how many of those early on successful online brands have never put true kind of barcoding on their product. And certainly from a 3PL standpoint, and somebody who warehouses products, that's a challenge. But it's really a blocker to going any further in some of the channels those brands want to go into. So certainly the retail channel is a big part of it, other marketplaces and things of that nature. And so some of this early on preparation around things, as boring as it might seem, as barcoding and making sure that you have the right authentic barcodes, really make for a much easier scalability once you get that call, once you get that opportunity. And once you find out that something's really working for your brand, you can accelerate much further.
Hello and welcome to the Next Level Supply Chain with GS1 US, a podcast in which we explore the mind-bending world of global supply chains, covering topics such as automation, innovation, unique identity, and more. I'm your co-host, Reed.
And I'm Liz.
And welcome to the show.
We just had a great conversation with Wes from ShipBob. Such a cool guy and an amazing perspective on the supply chain. He covers key tips and tricks on helping your business grow. Should you still be focusing online or brick and mortar or somewhere in between? How businesses get themselves into physical retail space and the strategies on how to see continued success. And he dives into what he thinks the future of selling in retail will look like. It is a fascinating conversation. Hey, Wes, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
We're really looking forward to the conversation. You and I had a great conversation a few weeks ago, and we probably could have talked for an hour. So here's our opportunity to go a little bit deeper. Before we get into it, just a quick introduction, who you are, what your background is, and most importantly, what your role is and what ShipBob does.
Absolutely. Be happy to. So yes, Wes Duquette, I am the Vice President and General Manager of B2B and Retail at ShipBob. I have a history in e-commerce. A lot of my time has been spent over the last decade plus in e-commerce and SaaS technologies. And a big portion of my career has been around customer facing and customer leading teams. And being in front of customers, I love because I get to understand about their aspirations. How do they want to grow their business? What does it take to get to the next level? And at ShipBob, that's exactly what I do. So my team truly is what helps our merchant brands become omnichannel. So I think omnichannel is a pretty big buzzword thrown around, but ShipBob as a business is a tech-enabled 3PL. And what we do is we help small and medium businesses have this enterprise level supply chain power. And so those capabilities to truly go up against the big CPG brands. So ShipBob as a force within both the US and globally, we run about 50 warehouses in our network. And so for our merchant brands, we both hold, prepare, ship products, not just in kind of single direct consumer packages, which we certainly do, but also bulk shipping across the world to retailers everywhere. So a lot of my career has been just around helping brands grow, and ShipBob, I get to do a big part of that.
I want to jump right into that, helping brands grow. So with your experience and seeing different facets of all this, what are some of the key steps or key things that businesses need to do to take themselves to the next level?
This can differ a bit by the category that you're in, but there are a number of things from a structure standpoint and some of those next steps and aspirations that I see successful brands doing early on, even before they become big, right? And one of the biggest pieces is planning to become multi-channel. It is under this concept and umbrella of omni-channel, but most brands begin selling online. It's most often a direct-to-consumer brand that is started very small, often in somebody's garage. They get to kind of those next stages and steps. But the most successful brands I've seen are planning those next 2 or 3 steps ahead and starting to be strategic about what channels they will grow into. And those channels can be things like retailers and marketplaces and how you sell on Amazon. all of those types of things. But there's a bunch of other areas where brands have found really great growth around new markets. How do you think about taking that step to become global? Understanding your demand in these different regions, and then what are the next places you could start to not just distribute your products to, but also house in different countries. So those types of things are a really big part of that next step to being successful. And then the other big thing that a lot of my brands originally forget about, but very quickly realize is a necessity here, is how do you make sure that the infrastructure of your business, both physically, so with your product, your packaging, those types of things, your supply chain network, and then your back office systems, things like that. How do you make sure that those can support your next scale and phase of growth? And a lot of that seems like a lot to eat and digest early on. But usually when I walk brands through it is think about that next step in your strategy from a channel standpoint, start to make some inroads within those channels. And then from there, you'll start to understand how well your brand plays within there and what other iterations need to happen.
You made it seem very simple, but you did point out that there are a lot of pieces to this. So I just want to double click into this just a little bit more to make sure I'm really understanding it, because a lot of times like, oh, it's easy. It's still work, right? We still have work to do. But I think what you're pointing out is have a plan, have a destination, and then ask yourself at each step along the way, does this help me get to that destination? We've seen it all. Like, hey, I'm going to start off. I meet with companies all the time. We're pure B2C. We're direct to consumer. And I'm like, that's great. That's fantastic. What are you going to do when Walgreens calls? What are you going to do when CVS calls? What are you going to do when Target calls? Oh, well, we'll deal with it then. And they might be set up for it, but they might not. And you're talking these multi-channels, and you brought it a step further into global, right? And packaging. You said the word packaging. I wrote it down. A lot of people, and I know Liz is so excited about that aspect, but that is something we actually see. You see different packaging and different requirements in different parts of the world.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny that packaging actually ends up being one of those areas. So there's a couple things around, I put it under this broader kind of physical, tangible part of your business is the packaging, things around barcoding, of course, especially in the GS1 world. It's something that we often refer our new SMB, small, medium businesses, to partners like GS1 to make sure that they're getting authentic setup for what they're doing before they even get that call from Walgreens, as you mentioned, Reed. And so one of the big things that we've started to do early on in the life cycle of a brand is to mention a lot of those questions around have you considered or have you thought of? With social commerce, there's such a virality that can happen to brands really quickly before they know it. You'd be surprised how many of those early on successful online brands have never put true kind of barcoding on their product. And certainly from a 3PL standpoint and somebody who warehouses products, that's a challenge. But it's really a blocker to going any further in some of the channels those brands want to go into. So certainly the retail channel is a big part of it, other marketplaces and things of that nature. And so some of this early on preparation around things, as boring as it might seem, as barcoding and making sure that you have the right authentic barcodes, really make for a much easier scalability once you get that call, once you get that opportunity. And once you find out that something's really working for your brand, you can accelerate much further.
And not having to go backwards to change your packaging or get that foundational information, barcode, or something as simple as product dimensions, to go back and have to house that somewhere. Oh, well, I know I have it on an Excel spreadsheet because I emailed it to somebody. But to really get that right, you're right. It isn't fun or exciting, but it's just the basis of how commerce needs to work. Well, you said something interesting with social commerce. That's TikTok, right? I have 14-year-olds. I'm assuming social commerce is TikTok, or for me, Instagram and the middle-aged lady people doing makeup. That's social commerce. Would you call that the same as online or different?
So there's certainly a similarity in the strategy from a brand standpoint and from a fulfillment standpoint, right? The end game with a lot of that is single packages going to end consumers. And often it's an online way, of course, to interact with a brand. There is such a different approach and strategy that a lot of brands are using there. As you mentioned, Instagram, shopping through Instagram has been pretty limited. If you think about the scale of what Instagram truly is and the users, truly shopping on Instagram is fairly limited, especially compared to what we're now seeing in TikTok shop land. which is just a whole new level of volume and a whole new level of activity going on. But yeah, many brands are thinking of those differently. So between their true direct consumer and what they think of as their online channel, an offshoot is certainly social commerce. And the reason why they think about them, and I suggest to think about those differently, is there are only a few places you can fully control the experience. Often your .com website is that place. Now, when you start to think about being in other channels, whether it be social commerce, retail, on Amazon, there is a level of control you can still have. You can still have that brand identity, but you become much more dependent on different factors there. So a very big part of social commerce right now is influencers. Those are really great ways for eyeballs and driving traffic, but you do lose some of that controllability. And so the further you get away from that direct-to-consumer.com site, the less control you have over the full brand experience, if you will. That's where you start to expand your possibilities when you think about scale and reach, certainly.
And is online still the place to be? Is it still cool?
It's funny, between cool and economics, it's becoming less of the place to be. So I think probably everybody's familiar with, from a pandemic standpoint, the heyday, in a sense, for online commerce was 2020, 2021. And certainly because of the way consumers were forced to shop, you saw a massive upswing, of course, in the amount of activity going on online, the amount of direct to consumer type of activity. And so that's where a lot of our brands and small and medium businesses came into the market. Many of them were either forced online or chose that as the path, and it became a really big part of their business and a really big part of the structure. What we're seeing now, though, is because in the last 2 to 3 years, you've really seen a degradation of the economics in direct to consumer. Most of my brands from 2 to 3 years ago have seen a much higher acquisition cost for any direct to consumer new customer. There's a lot of factors in there. There's things around the way Facebook does its marketing, the way that Apple has changed the iOS rules. All of those types of things have made it challenging to be as targeted with your marketing spend in the direct to consumer space. And so what it's really driven is this need to look for additional channels. And, Reed, as we were talking early on, is that idea of where do you want to go and what's your omni-channel strategy going to be? A lot of our brands have just been forced to find another way to grow. Online is certainly still a viable channel to have, but we're finding for most of our brands, it's certainly not the only channel you can have. And so now we're starting to see this need to have a variety and diversity around channels. Certainly Amazon still is a really big player for many of our brands, but even in the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a much different economics depending on the category you sell in. There's a lot of things happening with seller fees. There's a lot of things happening with fulfilled by Amazon fees that have really changed. And so the economics are a lot different for some categories. And it's causing a lot of our brands to step back and say, gosh, how much do we want to promote these channels? How much do we want to make sure that we have a diversity across a number of channels? And a really big place that we see brands returning to now is retail. And I think a big part of that is we see a repeatable economics in retail. While it's often not as beneficially economical as maybe your direct to consumer channel might have been, it is something that really can be repeatable. And as businesses start to set up their supply chain and their planning for each year, retail is a really good place to start to make that foray into repeatability.
It's so interesting. So the customer acquisition cost, the CAC, don't like it when they call those out in the startup and financial meetings. And it's like, what is this number? What is that number? But this is something that we've heard of, honestly, going back mid 2023, that the market is so fluid. What do I mean by that? Kind of hitting on what you said, Wes, is that Amazon has certain knobs and levers they're pulling. Google has certain knobs and levers they're pulling. So these environments that you can't control, but they control how the masses see you, are changing, so that get rich quick side hustle, I'm going to use the 3PL and I'm going to do a couple things in direct to consumer. You can still do that, but your cost to acquire customers has significantly gone up because the game is changing. Is this something you've seen the last 20 years, or is this a moment in time type of thing? I kind of have my own opinion on this, but it's the cost of doing business almost. It's like you don't set it and forget it. You set it, and you watch it, and you tweak it, and you're constantly trying to get ahead of the game. And like hockey, where's the puck going to be? Not where is it right now?
Yeah, which is why, and Reed, I think there's a moment in time aspect to it. So I think maybe we're all familiar with that graphic that shows online commerce activity and how it shot up in 2020, right? It shot way up in 2020 and has started to level out. But as you take a step back and look at the last 15 and 20 years, well, that's kind of its similar trajectory it's been on, right? So there was an anomaly 4 years ago in 2020, and it lasted for a bit of time. But now, certainly, we are getting to this place where having a diverse set of options from a channel standpoint is really important. And kind of to your point of where the puck's going to go, this is why many of our brands start down these paths of looking at different marketplaces and retailers to start to make sure that they can iterate within those channels. I think many different brands have opinions or experiences in different channels and how it did or did not work for their brand. But all of those came through that trial and error process in a way, and understanding where their buyers are, how their buyers like to buy, and making sure that they leave those opportunities open. And again, kind of to our points before, how are you structuring your business today to make sure that you can pivot within those different areas? And then as one of the channels starts to catch fire, how are you able to go through and say, gosh, I need to 5x or 10x my manufacturing process? Same thing I talk about with a lot of our merchants supply chain. What if you had to 10x your orders tomorrow? What would you do? Is your manufacturing ready, right? Well, let's start to get to that place where we are. From a 3PL standpoint, we're very much in a scenario from ShipBob where we can tune up and tune down what we need to do within the facility. But it all depends on what happens upstream and in some cases downstream for these brands to make sure that's possible.
Yeah, we've heard from some of our other guests when you're selling online, even if you say, hey, we're going to sell only on Shopify in our own stores and we're not going to do anything on Amazon, you still need to register with Amazon to protect your brand. Like that was something that was really eye-opening to me. And now in January of 2023, there was not the TikTok shop environment. But now here we are a year later and they have it. So it's constantly changing. I want to ask you this. You mentioned it earlier, that retail, physical retail, which I think some people are going to roll their eyes and be like, what are you, crazy? Like, I haven't gone to a store in a while. You know, Amazon guy comes 3 times a day now, not even once a day. But you talked about, think about all the channels you want to go to. But what are some business tips that are top of mind for folks that have been in the D2C, direct to consumer space or online only? How do they get ready for retail? And should they proactively go after it? That's a question that I have personally, right? Because a lot of times it's like, we had no idea we were ever going to do that, but they came to us. And so we took advantage of it. And then the person next to them is like, well, they didn't come to us, but we went to them and we're doing just as well.
So we talked about getting your product ready, getting your supply chain ready. I think one of the really big things is, and Reed, it'll tap into a little bit of where do you want to go and kind of what's your end game, is really starting to understand how retail can play into the business growth that you want. And the reason I say it like that, those two different scenarios you mentioned happen very frequently with my brands. One is we tried really hard. We've been knocking on Walmart and Target and Walgreens doors. We've been really trying to get in. Or the other version is we've got such a great brand following, Target came to us. And the latter has been much more advantageous early on for our brands. And I'll tell you why, because you have to remember that anytime you're going into a relationship with a retailer, there is truly a negotiation aspect that does happen, right? And so it's very much like the laws of all negotiations in the sense that if you are desperate to be on the shelves, there is a chance that you'll be in a scenario where it's not the best scenario for your business economically. I've had this happen a lot of times with merchants that get into larger big box that start to do very low margin type pieces initially as they sell in. And they find as they ramp all of their different supply chain needs from a manufacturing standpoint and freight and all these different types of things, that they're truly not getting the economy of scale they thought through those retailers. And so having that planned idea as to when you go into the conversation with a buyer from retail is, where do your economics need to be for it to be right for your brand? There is some schools of thought that say any volume is good volume. That can be true depending on where you're at within the growth trajectory. But if you've gotten to a place where you know your economics, certainly know that as you start to have those conversations with retailers, there is a negotiation that happens. There is a number that they have a range of what they'll pay for the margin within your product, and know where you need to be with that. Yes, you will get some economy of scale as you grow the business likely, But you want to make sure that those channels are places that you want to continue to fill, because surely as you sign that agreement with the Walmarts and Targets of the world, their expectation is when they order, they get a full amount of fulfillment, and that will at times make you starve other channels. And so just make sure that even if you're not ready from a full manufacturing standpoint, you're getting what you want economically out of each channel, because at times you'll have to prioritize those retailer channels.
You just hit a little thread of these are the nuances of the business that people don't know until you've experienced it. And that's when you have a major player and you have great relationships with, say, 7 other channels, right? Or 3 other channels, but they're not major channels, but you've been with them for 4 years. You got good relationships. Everything is steady Eddie. And then all of a sudden the big fish comes along and it's like, we want you in. And then they ask an order and the minimum order is 4 times more than what you've been producing. And now you're pulling from all the inventory, and now your other ones, it's like they're losing sale opportunities as well. Is that a common experience that happens that you see, or is these onesie twosies, or is this like, no, it happens like almost everybody?
Yeah, so my experience is probably a bit specific as to who it happens to. Typically, if you're Procter & Gamble, that's often not happening to you, right? You've had the long-term relationship with the Target and Walmart of the world. Because my subset of brands is often small and medium businesses, this is often one of the first forays into retail or kind of these high volume channels, right? And so I don't know that I'll say it happens often, but it certainly is a scenario where, as I talk with my merchants, I say, make sure that you're ready to support the needs of that retailer. And that can be those big 4, 5, 10x orders that come out of there. So it certainly happens more frequently to our small and medium brands. And usually it's in a good way. It means that you've gone from 500 to 1,500 doors within a big box retailer. That's a great scenario, right? But it doesn't always mean that you've planned and prepared for that from a manufacturing standpoint. So often when we are talking through brands that are starting to launch in retail, it is make sure you have a really good idea of the forecast and plan for success as well. Because when you do get to that place where hopefully you sell through in this test set that you get with a small amount of doors, well, that's when it will really launch in, and know kind of how big that range can be, because those are the types of things that you may need to look at additional manufacturers, those types of things that come from co-packers. And so, yeah, it is kind of having that idea of the possible as you start to go into those conversations and having a plan attack. And that's where buyers can usually be really good advocates, but know that they have a set of economics to keep, and making sure that you're protective of your brand and your business is important.
The scenario we just described, right? It's a hiccup. It's a big bump in the road for these SMBs. Is this something that's like when you go to the doctor, it's like, yeah, we see it all the time. You're going to feel terrible for a week and you'll get over it and you'll be stronger afterwards? Or is this like, oh, this is serious. If you get through it, you'll get through it. But if you don't, you're done. Or is it really like, well, it really depends and there's too many variables to take in place? I'm just thinking of the folks that are sitting there going, I want to start this business and I'm doing a little out of my garage and got to pay for the 3PL now and I'm thin cost, but I know if I do more volume, like all these things are going through their head. And sometimes you're like, yeah, that's growth. And that's the small setback and it's going to feel really painful, but just keep grinding through it, get to the other side. I think that's the direct question I have. Is this a common thing, or is this is a make or break moment?
Yeah, Reed, it's a fun question because for the most part, even if it is a make or break moment, there are ways to protect you get through these make or break moments, right? And so I certainly have seen this with most retail launches for SMBs, because what's happening is you're taking 1 or 2 channels you've been in, your online channel, your Amazon channel, and in some cases, you're blowing all of that up. Within a few weeks of purchase orders, you're going to do your entire year's volume. And often you haven't set up your co-manufacturer, you haven't set up all of these things upstream, raw materials, all those types of things maybe have not been set up. And so I do think there is what I usually think of as this 0 to 1, the first time you're doing it. There is this 0 to 1 aspect that happens within the first large retailer launch you go to. But kind of to your point of we'll get through this and we'll get better at this. Now I see as my merchants go from first major big box retail launch into number 2 and 3, they are still making these big jumps and they're still making some of these trade-off decisions of, gosh, I've got to actually slow down some of the marketing in my online channel because I won't have enough to serve that. but the extremity with which they're having to do that is lessened each time, right? The real challenge becomes, I think, initially what we find when you have to do these big manufacturing runs that you haven't prepared for, or some of these rush type things, is you will start moving product across the world and across the country at a much faster rate than you needed to previously. And so, whereas longer into your life cycle, you'll be much more planned, you'll be looking at purchase orders and sending manufacturing requests 6 or 12 months out. Well, now you're looking at weeks out. These types of things need to be accelerated. And that's where a lot of the economics of it start to break down, because now you're trying to go rush manufacturing. And then often I see merchants saying, gosh, instead of waiting for it to come across on the boat from my Asia manufacturer, I need to air freight some of this. And so now you're starting to degrade all that metrics there. And so to your point, it is something that can break your business, right? But I see most businesses start to get into a really good forecasting mechanism where they say, all right, this is what things we're going to do as a one-off. We're going to air freight this time because we need to make sure that we keep the big box retailer happy. Once you get past those points and you start to get to a normal sell-through, usually you won't have those big spikes as much, and you will have brought your infrastructure to a place where you're having much more kind of repeatable type activity instead of these big spikes and jumps, if you will.
I was going to ask you if there was a formula or a best practice when these SMBs are selling into retailers, but it feels like from all the things that you said, there isn't a formula, like one formula you can give to an SMB. It really varies on their business and who they're talking to. Is that right?
Yeah, it can. Look, I think that being able to guide your success in retail can start as early as you like. So one of the really interesting things, Liz, that I've seen from a lot of the big box retailers. So both Walmart and Target have these accelerator programs, which is Walmart's is called, I think, Walmart Start. Target has Target accelerators. And we've had a couple of our brands become alumni of those, which is, one of them was a beauty brand that goes through this accelerator program. And so what I usually say is there's a multitude of ways to have that first step into retail. You can work through agencies and brokers, things of that nature. You can certainly go it your own, or there's some of these kind of bespoke programs that are great. And so I think that that's one of the pieces that starts out at a multitude of different ways. But one of the things that I have seen similar, Liz, is once you're in the doors of retail, there's a couple kind of strategies that I've seen that can help with your success. We talked about knowing the economics of your business, certainly, so that you can make sure your business is successful from an economic standpoint. But the 2 or 3 things I usually have said is, the first is make sure you're ready to support the needs of that retailer. We talked about having certainly what they order, but there's some really interesting things happening with a couple big box that really want to start to provide exclusive type products to their buyers. So Target is pretty notorious in a good way for this, that they want to make sure that what you can buy at Target, you can't get everywhere else or every other big box store. And so one of the things I typically have said to a lot of our merchants that are going to Target is be ready to provide an exclusive SKU. Be ready to think about how you differentiate something for not just this channel of retail, but potentially some of the retailers in there. It almost goes back to how you set up your entire product and packaging. Are you able to iterate and pivot on some of those to make a unique SKU for Target or some other retailer? So those are some important things early on. And then one of the really interesting parts that I've seen successful SMBs in retail is how do they participate in the sell-through of their items at retail? One of the really interesting things about these brands is usually they are very adept at some level of their own marketing. This is typically how they've grown the brand themselves. It's also why they use services like ShipBob as their 3PL, because they'll outsource a lot of things so they can focus on what they're good at, often marketing and growing their brand. And one of the things I've always said is think about participating in how you're marketing to your buying base that you're now in retail. And so instead of sending those buyers potentially through that online channel like you've typically done, how about sending them to retailers? How about going into your retail store? You'll see a lot of influencers that now walk the floors of a retail and show, here's our display at XYZ big box, right? Those are a lot of the things where you can start to be able to influence how successful you are in retail. And then very much that is when at the end of the quarter, at the end of the season, each time retailers go back and look at all of the performance, that's what they're going to replenish with. That's what they're going to put into additional stores and doors. And so that's one of the really interesting places where these online brands that we have that often have a really good control of what can, happen marketing wise with their small buying group. Well, if you can start to turn that into what happens in retail as well, you can really start to influence your ability to be successful.
I could geek out on this all day long, but we're running out of time. I wanted to get through a couple of other things. What do you see happening in the not so distant future? Like just around the corner. So we were heavy retail. Online's been around for 24 plus years. It's still the wild, wild west. TikTok has announced that they now have online commerce that's happening. Shopify has been up and down with the markets. 3 years ago was the hottest thing out there. It's kind of coming back a little bit. And, these are normal growth types of things. You mentioned at the beginning of our podcast that retail, like this is the spot. What do you see in the not so distant future, next 2 to 3 years?
Where I'm seeing a lot of things trend towards is kind of this experience commerce, and it's starting to really mold with what's happening in social commerce, but experience commerce is becoming big, right? And TikTok has actually done it the best. Liz, we were talking a bit about Instagram and shopping through Instagram, which has certainly happened, but has not been done at a high volume and high growth quite yet. We are really seeing a lot of our brands tap into this experience commerce type piece, which is very much an offshoot of having all of these different brands in front of you from a bunch of different, not only social channels, but even retail and those types of things. And so we're seeing that a lot of that type of thing can be done through influencers. A lot of this type of thing can still be done through retail. And so connecting those two is probably the next frontier. But yeah, Reed, I see a really big play in here, which is probably still under the umbrella of social commerce, but it's very much that people being experienced within your brand, having influencers or other users of your brand out in front, and that being a very clickable and very actionable purchase that happens through there, whether it is truly through an online forum or some ability to do it in physical space.
I can absolutely see that. I'm seeing a lot more QR code advertisements on TV, YouTube, websites, where it's like, it's not that much different than going to the website and filling it out, but having that code that takes you right to the spot to get product or the experience with product. What's old is new again. What's new is old again.
Yes.
Very true. So before we say goodbye, Reed and I always ask our guests 2 final questions. The first one is, in your life, whether it's work, whether it's home life, what is the favorite technology that you're using right now?
Well, Reed, this is funny. What's old is new again is very much for me. My favorite new technology, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Remarkable tablet.
Oh, yeah. Remarkable tablet. Sure.
And so what's old is new again. For me, I'm a very hands-on kind of learner, meaning I need to write it to learn it.
Yep.
I used to have notebooks, and I tried to transition to figuring out how it would be electronically done, and should I just be typing this into OneNote? And so funny enough, I'm still doing all the types of writing I do, but being able to take that and put it into electronic form, that is kind of my new favorite technology right now. So yeah, Reed, I think it's an old is new again in a version for me when it comes to the tablet. Now it feels like writing on paper, and I can put it all electronically as I need and put it off into an email that way.
Yeah, and for those of you that haven't seen Remarkable, I think they're up to their 3rd version of it, or at least their 2nd version. And it is a really cool tablet, very thin, very lightweight. It is really just for writing. I mean, you're not going to watch movies on this, but the writing experience on it is like writing in a notebook. I use an iPad and I write on it every day, but it's not the same experience as Remarkable, hence their name. Okay. The last question. In your lifetime, what is something that has just totally blown your mind and changed the way that you look at the world going forward?
I think we're seeing it right now because it hasn't hit its pinnacle or peak. We talked a lot about TikTok Shop. I think there is even more to happen in this space. From somebody who does fulfillment as a business, understanding what can happen in that world and how many eyeballs can be driven and actions can be taken from that. And then what that means for us in a fulfillment center each and every day as we do some level of TikTok fulfillment. It's very interesting. So I see it only as something that is still on its way up and has yet to kind of hit its pinnacle. So To me, it's fascinating to see something that can drive so much volume and has really engaged an entire population. Whether it's people in their 60s and 70s I talk to that learn how to do things on TikTok. I've got a young daughter that is fascinated by making videos on there. So I think there's an interesting place here. And somebody who's on the commerce side, I see that as maybe it won't only be TikTok. I think there'll be other places, but we're really seeing the application of how that can really connect into commerce and how it can change behaviors.
Well, Wes, we can't thank you enough for spending the time with us here today, and we'd encourage people to check you out and ShipBob, and we know that our paths will cross again because we've seen you at a couple of conferences and speaking. So thank you. This has been truly a treat. Appreciate your time.
Great to be a part of. Great to chat.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Next Level Supply Chain with GS1 US. If you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe to our feed and explore more great episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to share and follow us on social media. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.